The sun hung low over the desert, turning everything orange and gold. Staff Sergeant Devin Hayes squinted through the dust as his convoy rolled down the narrow road. He'd done this route 100 times before, maybe more, but something felt different today. Maybe it was the unusual quiet, or maybe it was just that feeling soldiers get when they've been deployed too long. Back home in Atlanta, his 12-year-old daughter Kendra sat glued to the television. Her mother, Patricia, tried to pull her away from the news, but the girl wouldn't budge. Every report from overseas made her heart race. Every mention of conflict zones made her hold her breath. "Baby, you can't watch this all day," Patricia said softly, touching her daughter's shoulder. "Your daddy is fine. He knows what he's doing." Kendra didn't look away from the screen. "You don't know that, Mama, you don't know." Patricia felt a chill run through her, but she pushed it away. Devin was strong. Devin was smart. He'd come home just like he always did. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Devin was checking in with his squad. There were 5 of them in the lead vehicle. Corporal Javier Cruz sat beside him, nervously tapping his finger against his rifle. In the back, Private First Class Amy Lynn kept her eyes on the surrounding buildings. The 2 youngest members, barely 20 years old, tried to look brave but couldn't hide their nerves. "Stay sharp," Devin said, his voice calm and steady. "We're almost through." That's when the first explosion hit. The blast came from the left side, flipping the rear vehicle like a toy. Devin's training kicked in before his mind could even process what was happening. "Contact left! Move, move, move!" Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. The ambush was perfectly planned, perfectly executed. They'd been waiting for this convoy, studying their patterns, choosing the exact spot where the road narrowed and escape routes were limited. Devin's vehicle swerved hard, but there was nowhere to go. Another explosion rocked the ground in front of them. Amy screamed as shrapnel tore through the armor plating. Javier was shouting coordinates into the radio, calling for backup, his voice cracking with adrenaline. "We need to get to cover," one of the younger soldiers yelled. Devin looked ahead. There was a cluster of broken buildings about 50 yards away. It wasn't much, but it was something. The problem was the kill zone between here and there. Open ground. No protection. Whoever ran for it would be exposed. He made his decision in less than a second. "Javier, take them to those buildings. Now, what about you? I'll draw their fire. Give you a chance to make it." "Sergeant, no, that's an order, Corporal." Devin kicked open his door and opened fire toward the enemy positions. The effect was immediate. Dozens of weapons turned toward him, bullets chewing up the ground around his feet. But his squad was moving, running, staying low, heading for safety. He kept firing, kept moving, kept drawing attention. He could see his team making progress. Almost there. Just a few more seconds. That's when he felt the first bullet hit his shoulder, then his leg, then his chest. The world tilted sideways. The ground came up to meet him hard. He could hear Javier screaming his name, but the sound was distant, like it was coming from underwater. Amy was crying. Someone was yelling about retreat. Devin tried to speak, tried to tell them to go, to leave him and save themselves, but no words came out. Just blood and pain and the terrible realization that he might not make it home this time. The gunfire intensified. His squad had no choice. Stay and die or retreat and live. Javier made the impossible call, the one that would haunt him forever. They ran for the extraction point, leaving their sergeant behind in the dust. Devin's last conscious thought before everything went black was of Kendra. Her smile. Her laugh. The way she used to climb on his shoulders when she was little. He'd promised her he'd always come home. 48 hours later, 2 military officers stood on the front porch of the Hayes family home. They wore their dress uniforms. Their faces were somber. They'd done this before, but it never got easier. Patricia saw them through the window and felt her legs go weak. No, not this. Not today. Not ever. Kendra was upstairs doing homework when she heard the doorbell. She heard her mother's footsteps. Heard the door open, then heard a sound she'd never heard before. Her mother's scream, raw and broken and full of agony. The girl ran down the stairs, her heart pounding. She saw the officers, saw their uniforms, saw the look in their eyes. And she knew. She knew before they said a single word. "No," she whispered. Then louder, "No." The older officer stepped forward. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm so sorry to inform you, no." Kendra's scream cut through everything. She pushed past her mother, getting right in the officer's face. "You're lying." My dad isn't dead.
He isn't.
Patricia tried to hold her, but Kendra fought against her mother's arms. The neighbors started coming out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. The scene unfolded the way it had 1,000 times before in 1,000 different homes. A family destroyed in an instant by the cost of service and sacrifice. He's not coming home? Kendra sobbed, finally collapsing against her mother. He promised. He promised he'd come back. The officers stood there helplessly, these bearers of the worst news imaginable. They had procedures to follow, information to convey, support to offer. But none of it mattered. Nothing they could say would make this better. That night, Kendra lay in her bed staring at the ceiling. She could hear her mother crying in the next room, talking on the phone with relatives, making arrangements for a funeral for a man whose body was still somewhere overseas in hostile territory. The girl got up and walked to her father's study. She stood in the doorway looking at his desk, his books, his medals displayed on the wall. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, waiting for him to come home and sit down and be here again, but he never would. She picked up a framed photo from the desk. Her father in uniform, standing with his squad, all of them smiling, all of them looking so confident and strong. She stared at their faces, these men and women who'd been with her father when he died, and then, in the quiet darkness of that room, a thought took root in her mind, a thought that would grow into an accusation, a thought that would change everything. They left him. They came home, but he didn't. They survived, but he didn't. Her father was dead and they were alive. Someone had to be responsible. Someone had to pay. The funeral was scheduled for 2 weeks later. 2 weeks felt like 2 years. Kendra hadn't spoken more than a few words since that day. She moved through the house like a ghost, barely eating, barely sleeping. Patricia tried everything, cooking her favorite meals, sitting with her, just being there. But nothing reached the girl. It was like she'd built a wall around herself, and grief was the only thing allowed inside. The day of the memorial service arrived with gray skies and cold wind. Patricia dressed Kendra in a black dress the girl had outgrown months ago, but nobody cared about things like that anymore. What did it matter? What did any of it matter? The chapel was packed. Devin had been loved by so many people. Family, friends, neighbors, people from the community who'd watched him grow up. But Kendra only had eyes for one group, the soldiers, his squad, the 5 people who'd been with her father on his last day. They sat together near the front, their dress uniforms crisp and perfect. But their faces told a different story. Javier Cruz looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes were hollow, dark circles underneath making him look 10 years older. Amy Lynn kept her hands folded so tight her knuckles were white. The others stared straight ahead, barely blinking like they were afraid to move or feel or remember. The ceremony began with all the usual things. The flag, the prayers, people talking about honor and duty and sacrifice. Words that meant nothing to a 12-year-old girl who just wanted her father back. Then came the eulogy. A commanding officer who'd never even met Devin stood at the podium, reading from a paper about bravery and service. Every word felt empty to Kendra. Every sentence felt like a lie. Staff Sergeant Devin Hayes gave his life so that others might live, the officer said. His actions in the face of overwhelming danger saved his entire squad. He is a hero in the truest sense of the word. Something inside Kendra snapped. Maybe it was the word hero. Maybe it was the way everyone was acting like this was noble and beautiful when it was actually just horrible and wrong. Maybe it was seeing those soldiers sitting there alive and breathing while her father was gone forever. She stood up. Her mother tried to pull her back down, but Kendra jerked her arm away. The chapel went silent. Everyone turned to look at the small girl in the too tight black dress. You left him. Her voice was quiet at first, but it carried in the silence. You all left him there. Kendra, please, Patricia whispered, horrified, but the girl was done being quiet. Done being the good daughter who held it together. She turned to face the squad directly, and her voice grew louder, stronger, filled with all the pain and anger that had been building for 2 weeks. You killed my dad. The words hung in the air like a bomb. Amy Lynn let out a choked sob. Javier closed his eyes, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. One of the younger soldiers started shaking. You came home, but he didn't. You're alive, but he's dead. How could you leave him? How could you just run away and leave him there to die? Kendra, that's enough! Patricia stood up, trying to grab her daughter, but Kendra backed away, tears streaming down her face now. He saved you. He died for you. And you just left him like he was nothing. The chapel erupted in whispers. Some people looked at the squad with suspicion now. Others looked uncomfortable, unsure of what to think. The commanding officer tried to regain control, but the damage was done. Patricia finally got hold of Kendra and pulled her toward the exit. The girl was sobbing now, all the fight gone out of her, replaced by raw grief. They left the chapel with everyone staring, the ceremony in ruins. The squad sat frozen in their seats. They'd expected judgment, whispers, questions, but hearing it from Devon's daughter, in her voice with her pain, that was something else entirely. That was unbearable. After the service, people didn't know what to say to them. Some shook their hands and offered condolences, but the words felt hollow. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The seed of doubt had been planted. Had they really done everything they could? Had they abandoned their sergeant? Javier drove home alone, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his fingers hurt. He kept replaying that day, the ambush, the gunfire, Devon's order, the impossible choice. Every single second was burned into his memory like a brand. He'd made the call to retreat. He was second in command. When Devon went down, the responsibility fell to him. Stay and die or leave and survive. He'd chosen survival for the squad. But what did survival mean if you couldn't live with yourself afterward? He hadn't eaten a proper meal since they got back. Food tasted like ash. Sleep brought nightmares. Devon's face, the sound of gunfire, Kendra's screaming voice echoing through his dreams. Every morning he woke up wishing he'd made a different choice. Wishing he'd stayed. Wishing it had been him instead. Amy wasn't doing any better. She'd stopped answering calls from her family. Stopped going to the mandatory counseling sessions. She sat in her apartment for hours just staring at the wall, replaying everything. She kept thinking about Devon's daughter. That little girl who'd lost her father because Amy had run. Because Amy had chosen her own life over his. The guilt was eating all of them alive, but Kendra's words had made it worse. They'd weaponized what the squad already felt. Turned their private shame into public accusation. The community was divided now. Some understood the reality of combat. The impossible decisions, the split-second choices between life and death. Others whispered at coffee shops and grocery stores about cowardice and abandonment. 3 days after the funeral, Javier sat alone in his apartment at 2 a.m. He'd been staring at a map of the region where Devon had fallen. The area was still hostile, still dangerous, still controlled by enemy forces. But Devon's body was still there. Somewhere. Left behind because they'd had no choice. Left to the desert and the dust and the people who'd killed him. Javier made a decision. He picked up his phone and sent a text to Amy. Just 4 words. "We're going back." Her response came 30 seconds later. "When?" He texted the other 3 squad members. Got the same response from each. No questions. No hesitation. Just agreement. They all knew what it meant. Going back without orders was desertion. They'd face court-martial, prison time, the end of their careers. Everything they'd worked for would be gone. But none of that mattered anymore. Not really. Devon had saved their lives. Had sacrificed himself so they could survive. And they'd left him behind. That debt had to be paid. That wrong had to be made right, consequences be damned. They met the next night at Javier's place. 5 soldiers planning an unauthorized mission into hostile territory. It was insane. It was illegal. It was probably suicide. But Kendra's words kept echoing in all their minds. "You killed my dad." Maybe they had. Maybe running had been the wrong choice. Maybe they should have stayed and fought and died beside him. They couldn't change the past. Couldn't undo what happened. But they could do one thing. They could bring Devon home. Or die trying. "We leave in 3 days," Javier said, looking at each of them. Last chance to back out. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The decision had already been made, really, the moment Kendra had screamed those words in the chapel. They were going back. For Devon, for themselves. For a 12-year-old girl who'd lost her father and needed someone to blame. They were going to finish what they'd started, or they weren't coming back at all. The 5 of them stood in the cargo hold of a transport plane, their faces painted with camouflage, their hearts pounding with fear and determination. They'd called in every favor, used every connection, and lied to everyone who mattered. As far as the military knew, they were on leave. As far as their families knew, they were on base. Nobody knew the truth. They were ghosts now. Off the grid. Off the books. 5 soldiers on an unauthorized mission that could get them all killed or imprisoned for life. Javier checked his weapon for the 100th time. His hands weren't shaking anymore. Once you crossed the line from thinking about something to actually doing it, a strange calm took over. There was no room for doubt now. No room for second thoughts. 30 minutes to drop zone, the pilot called back. He was an old friend who owed Javier a debt from years ago. He didn't ask questions. Didn't want to know. Just flew the plane and pretended this wasn't happening. Amy sat with her eyes closed, breathing slowly, centering herself the way Devon had taught them. He'd always said that fear was useful if you controlled it, deadly if you didn't. She wondered if he'd been afraid in those final moments. If he'd known they'd come back for him someday. The youngest member of their group, a kid named Tyler who'd barely been in the service 2 years, looked like he might throw up. This was way beyond anything he'd signed up for, but he was here anyway because Devon had saved his life, and that meant something. Meanwhile, back at military command headquarters half a world away, an intelligence analyst was going through intercepted communications. Most of it was routine, enemy movements, supply lines, the usual chatter. But one piece of information made her stop cold. A prisoner, Western, military, being held at a compound 60 miles from where Staff Sergeant Devon Hayes had fallen. She ran the details through the system, cross-referencing dates and locations. Her hands started shaking as the pieces came together. It couldn't be. They'd listed Hayes as killed in action. His memorial service had already happened. But the timing matched. The description matched. She grabbed the report and ran to her supervisor's office, bursting through the door without knocking. "Sir, we have a possible POW situation. It might be Hayes." Her supervisor looked up from his desk, confused. "Hayes is dead." "Maybe not, sir. Look at this." He read through the intelligence, his expression growing more serious with each line. If Hayes was alive and they'd declared him dead, if they'd held a memorial service while he was being held prisoner, this was a nightmare. A public relations disaster. A failure of epic proportions. "Get me Central Command," he said quietly. "Right now." Within an hour, the entire chain of command knew. A rescue operation was ordered. But it would take time to plan, to organize, to get approval from every level of bureaucracy. Weeks maybe. Maybe longer. Devon didn't have weeks. The compound where he was being held looked like every other abandoned building in the region. Crumbling walls, broken windows, scorch marks from old battles. But guards walked the perimeter and lights burned inside. Someone was definitely using it. Devon lay on a concrete floor in a room that smelled like decay and desperation. His injuries had been left untreated. His shoulder was infected. His ribs were probably broken. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Time losing all meaning in the darkness, but he hadn't given up. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Kendra's face. Heard her laugh. Remembered teaching her to ride a bike, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories when she was small. Those memories kept him breathing when his body wanted to quit. He'd also been watching his captors, learning their patterns, counting guards, mapping exits in his mind. If an opportunity came, he'd be ready. He'd get out or die trying. Back in the sky above the desert, Javier's team prepared to jump. The plane couldn't land, too risky, too visible. They'd have to parachute in and hike to the target location, 6 miles through hostile territory in the dark. "Remember," Javier said, his voice steady despite everything. "We get in, we find Devon or confirm he's gone, and we get out. No heroes, no unnecessary risks. We do this smart." They all nodded, but everyone knew the truth. This entire mission was an unnecessary risk. This was the opposite of smart. But sometimes the right thing and the smart thing weren't the same. They jumped into darkness, their parachutes opening silently above them. The desert floor came up fast. Tyler hit hard and rolled, grunting with pain but staying quiet. One by one, they regrouped, buried their chutes, and started moving. The terrain was brutal, rocky, uneven. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound could mean discovery. They moved the way Devon had taught them, low, slow, aware of everything. 3 hours into the hike, they spotted a patrol. 6 hostile fighters moving along a ridge. Javier held up his fist and everyone froze. They couldn't engage. Couldn't risk the noise. Had to wait it out. 15 minutes felt like 15 hours, but the patrol passed without incident. They kept moving. At military command, the official rescue operation was being planned with agonizing slowness. risk assessments, rules of engagement, political considerations. All while Devon sat in that cell running out of time. A young officer named Lieutenant Chen spoke up in the planning meeting. "Sir, with respect, every hour we wait decreases the chance of a successful rescue. If Hayes is alive, we need to move now." The colonel in charge gave her a hard look. "Lieutenant, I understand your concern, but we follow protocol. A rushed mission puts more lives at risk. And a delayed mission might mean we're rescuing a body instead of a soldier." She shot back. The room went quiet. She was right, and everyone knew it. But the military didn't move fast. Couldn't move fast. Too many rules. Too many regulations. Too much bureaucracy. While they argued, Javier's team reached the compound. They'd made good time, pushing through exhaustion and pain. Now came the hard part. They set up observation positions around the perimeter. Amy counted guards. Tyler mapped the building layout. The others watched for patrols, any sign of Devon, any indication this wasn't a wasted trip. Then Amy saw him. Through a cracked window on the ground floor. A figure lying on the floor, barely moving. She couldn't see his face clearly, but something about the way he held himself, even in obvious pain, looked familiar. She clicked her radio twice, the signal they'd agreed on. Possible target located. Javier moved to her position and looked through his scope. His heart stopped. That was Devon. Thinner, injured, barely recognizable, but definitely Devon. Alive. "He's here," Javier whispered, his voice cracking. "He's actually alive." The relief lasted about 2 seconds before reality kicked in. Now they had to get him out. Past the guards. Past the patrols. Past everything standing between them and home. This was going to get messy. Javier looked at his team, saw the same determination in their eyes that he felt. They'd come this far. "No turning back now, we go in 1 hour," he said. Before dawn, before they expect anything, they checked their weapons, said silent prayers, and thought about the girl back home who'd screamed that they killed her father. Soon they'd prove her wrong. Or die trying. Devon in his cell opened his eyes. He didn't know why, but something felt different tonight. Something in the air. A change coming. He whispered his daughter's name one more time and waited for whatever came next. The hour before dawn is the quietest time in the desert. Even the insects seemed asleep. That silence made every sound the squad made feel like thunder in their ears. Javier moved first, cutting through the fence with practiced precision. The metal gave way without much resistance. These weren't professional soldiers guarding the compound, just fighters who thought nobody would be crazy enough to attack them here. They were about to learn different. Amy slipped through the gap, followed by Tyler and the others. 5 shadows moving through darkness, their hearts hammering, but their training keeping them steady. Devon had taught them well. Now they'd use everything he'd given them to save him. The first guard never saw them coming. Tyler took him down silently, lowering the body to the ground without a sound. 1 down, at least 8 more to go. Inside his cell, Devon heard something. A sound that didn't belong. His eyes opened, and despite the pain, despite the fever from his infected wounds, his mind sharpened. Something was happening. He tried to sit up, his body protesting every movement. His shoulders screamed. His ribs felt like broken glass grinding together. But he forced himself upright, forced himself to be ready. If this was a rescue, he needed to be able to move. If this was an execution, he'd go down fighting. The compound had 3 levels. Devon was on the ground floor, which was good. But there were guards in the hallway, and the main entrance was heavily watched. Javier knew a frontal assault would get them all killed. "Side entrance," he whispered into his radio. "Amy, Tyler, you're with me. The rest of you covering positions. Anyone comes running, you slow them down." They split up, moving like ghosts through the compound. Every corner could hide an enemy. Every door could be their last. The tension was suffocating. Amy reached the side door first and tested it. Locked. Of course. She pulled out her tools and started working on it. Her hands steady despite her racing pulse. 20 seconds, 30. Come on, click. The door opened. They were in. The hallway inside smelled like mold and gunpowder. Old blood stained the concrete floors. This place had seen violence long before tonight. Javier moved down the corridor, checking each door. Empty. Empty. Storage room. Empty. Then he found it. A heavy door with a guard standing outside looking bored and half asleep. The guard's eyes widened when he saw Javier. his hand moving toward his weapon, but Amy was faster. She dropped him before he could make a sound. Javier grabbed the keys from the guard's belt and unlocked the door. It swung open with a rusty creak that sounded impossibly loud, and there was Devon. Their sergeant looked like a ghost. He'd lost at least 30 pounds. His face was gaunt, his skin pale under the bruises and dirt. But his eyes were still sharp, still aware, still fighting. "Took you long enough," Devon whispered, the ghost of a smile on his cracked lips. Javier felt tears burning his eyes but pushed them back. No time for emotion. No time for anything but getting out alive. "Can you walk?" "Do I have a choice?" Not really. They got Devon to his feet. He gasped in pain but didn't cry out. Amy slung his arm over her shoulder, taking most of his weight. Tyler took the other side. They started moving back toward the exit. That's when the alarm went off. Someone had found the dead guards. Someone had raised the alert. Suddenly the entire compound came alive with shouts and running footsteps. Lights flipped on. Doors started opening. "Go, go, go!" Javier yelled into his radio. "We're blown!" The covering team opened fire, creating chaos and confusion. Hostile fighters ran in every direction, unsure where the attack was coming from, how many attackers there were. The element of surprise was gone, but the confusion bought precious seconds. Devon tried to move faster, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Every step was agony. "Leave me," he gasped. "You can move faster without—" "Not happening," Amy cut him off. "We didn't come all this way to leave you again." They made it to the side entrance. Bullets started hitting the walls around them, sending chips of concrete flying. Tyler returned fire, dropping 2 fighters who'd gotten too close. The squad was operating on pure adrenaline now, training and instinct taking over where thought couldn't. Outside, they rigged Devon onto a makeshift stretcher using supplies they'd brought. 2 of them carried while the others provided cover fire. The desert offered little protection, but darkness was still on their side, barely. They ran, or as close to running as possible while carrying an injured man through rough terrain. Devon faded in and out of consciousness, each jolt of the stretcher sending fresh waves of pain through his body. But through it all, one thought kept him anchored. Kendra. He was going home to Kendra. Behind them, the pursuit was organizing. Vehicles started up. Searchlights swept the desert. They had maybe a 5-minute head start. Maybe Javier pulled out his radio, switching to a frequency he'd hoped he wouldn't need to use. It was a direct line to military command, and using it meant admitting everything. Admitting they'd gone AWOL. Admitting they'd launched an unauthorized mission. Admitting they'd broken every rule in the book. But Devon was alive, and that was worth any punishment. "This is Corporal Javier Cruz, serial number 2748963. We have Staff Sergeant Devon Hayes. He's alive. We're 6 miles northeast of Checkpoint Gamma with hostile forces in pursuit. We need immediate extraction." The silence on the other end lasted forever. Then a voice crackled through, calm and professional despite what they'd just heard. "Copy that, Corporal. Be advised, extraction already en route to your location. Hold position and prepare for pickup." Javier nearly dropped the radio. They were already coming? How? At military command, Lieutenant Chen allowed herself a small smile. They'd been tracking the AWOL squad from the moment they'd left. Had known about the unauthorized mission from the start, and while officially they couldn't approve or support such action, unofficially they could make sure rescue assets were in the area. Just in case, sometimes the rules needed bending. Sometimes doing the right thing meant looking the other way at the right moment. The squad found a defensive position among some rocks and set up a perimeter. Devon was placed in the center, as protected as possible. They could hear the vehicles getting closer. See the dust clouds rising in the growing dawn light. "They're going to be on us in 2 minutes, Tyler said, checking his ammunition. Running low. They all were. Then they heard it. A sound more beautiful than any music. The deep thump of helicopter rotors. Not just one. Multiple birds incoming. The desert started shaking. The ground literally vibrated as heavy vehicles approached from the opposite direction. Military vehicles. Friendly forces. The cavalry had arrived. Attack helicopters swept overhead, their weapon systems targeting the pursuing hostile forces. The enemy vehicles scattered, realizing they'd just gone from hunters to hunted. Ground units rolled in, forming a protective barrier around the squad's position. A medical helicopter touched down, its medics jumping out before the skids even settled. They rushed to Devon, immediately starting treatment, getting fluids into him, stabilizing his wounds. Javier stood there, watching it all unfold, barely able to process what was happening. They'd done it. Against all odds, against all common sense, they'd actually done it. Devin, being loaded onto the helicopter, grabbed Javier's hand with what little strength he had left. "Tell Kendra," he whispered. "Tell her I'm coming home." Javier nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The helicopters lifted off, carrying Devin toward safety. The squad stood in the desert, surrounded by the military forces that had saved them, knowing they'd face consequences for what they'd done. Court-martial. Possibly prison. But as the sun rose over the desert, painting everything gold and orange, none of that mattered. They'd brought their sergeant home. They'd proven that no one gets left behind. Whatever punishment came next, they'd face it together, just like Devin had taught them. The military hospital in Germany smelled like antiseptic and cafeteria food. Devin had been there for 3 weeks now, going through surgery after surgery. The infection in his shoulder had been worse than anyone thought. His ribs needed pins. His leg required extensive reconstruction. But he was alive. Against every odd, he was alive. The story had gone public almost immediately. Media outlets around the world ran with it. The soldier left behind who survived. The squad that went rogue to save him, the dramatic rescue. Devin's face was on every news channel. His story was being told by people who'd never met him, who didn't know about Kendra's smile or Patricia's strength or the promise he'd made to come home. But through all the noise and attention, there was one thing Devin wanted more than anything. One person he needed to see. Back in Atlanta, Patricia got the call she'd thought would never come. Her husband was alive. Not just alive, recovering. Getting stronger every day. And he wanted to see them. She stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand, crying so hard she couldn't breathe. Kendra came running down the stairs, fear on her face because her mother only cried like this when something terrible happened. "Mama, what's wrong?" Patricia turned to her daughter, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "Actually smiling for the first time in weeks, baby. Your daddy's alive. He's alive, and he wants to see us." Kendra froze. The words didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. They'd had a funeral. She'd screamed at his squad. She'd spent weeks drowning in guilt for the things she'd said. Her father was dead. That was the reality she'd learned to live with. "That's not funny, Mama. I'm not joking, baby. He's alive. He's in a hospital in Germany. They're flying us out tomorrow." Kendra's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the stairs, her mind refusing to process what she was hearing. Alive. Her father was alive. All those nights crying herself to sleep. All those hours staring at his photo. All those words she'd screamed at his squad. Words she could never take back. "I told them they killed him," she whispered. "I said terrible things." Patricia sat beside her daughter and pulled her close. "They know, honey. They know, and they don't blame you. None of this is your fault." But Kendra felt like it was. Felt like every horrible thing she'd said was carved into stone somewhere. Permanent and unforgivable. The flight to Germany was the longest of Kendra's life. She sat by the window, staring at clouds, trying to prepare herself for seeing her father. What would she say? How could she face him after what she'd done? And what about his squad? The people she'd accused? The ones who'd risked everything to bring him home? When they finally arrived at the hospital, a military escort led them through quiet hallways. Patricia held Kendra's hand so tight it almost hurt, but the girl was grateful for it. She needed something to anchor her to reality. They stopped outside a door, room 247. The escort knocked softly and stepped aside. "Go ahead," she said gently. Patricia opened the door slowly. The room was small and plain, medical equipment beeping softly. And there, sitting up in bed, looking thinner and more tired than Kendra had ever seen him, was her father. Devin's eyes found his daughter immediately. He tried to smile, but his lip was still split and healing. "Hey, baby girl." Kendra stood frozen in the doorway. She wanted to run to him, wanted to throw herself into his arms like she had 1,000 times before, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. The guilt was crushing her, holding her in place. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered. "Daddy, I'm so sorry." Devin's expression softened. He held out his arms, the left one still in a brace. "Come here, Kendra," that broke the spell. She ran to him, careful not to hurt him but needing to touch him to prove he was real. Devin wrapped his arms around his daughter and held her while she sobbed into his chest. I said terrible things. I told them they killed you. I was so angry and I didn't know. Shh, it's okay. Everything's okay now, but it's not. I hurt them. I said things I can't take back. Devin pulled back just enough to look at his daughter's face. Listen to me. You were a child who'd just lost her father, or thought she had. You were in pain, and pain makes us say things we don't mean. My squad knows that. They understand. But what if they hate me? They could never hate you. Never. Patricia joined them, and for a while the three of them just held each other and cried. Tears of relief, of joy, of release from weeks of unbearable grief. The nightmare was over. The family was whole again. Over the next few days, as Devin continued to heal, he told them everything. The ambush, the decision to draw fire, waking up in captivity, the weeks of pain and uncertainty, and how every single day the thought of Kendra kept him fighting to survive. You were the reason I didn't give up, he said. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw your face, heard your laugh. I'd made you a promise, remember? I promised I'd always come home. Kendra nodded, remembering. She'd been 8 years old, crying because he was leaving for deployment. He'd knelt down, looked her in the eyes, and made that promise. I thought you broke it, she said quietly. I never break my promises to you, not if I can help it. A knock on the door interrupted them. Javier stood in the hallway looking nervous. Amy was with him along with Tyler and the others. They'd come as soon as they heard Devin's family had arrived. Kendra saw them and felt her stomach drop. These were the people she'd accused. The people she'd blamed for her father's death while they were planning to risk everything to save him. Javier cleared his throat. We don't want to intrude. We just wanted to check on the sergeant and... He stopped when he saw Kendra staring at him. The girl stood up slowly. Walked over to where they stood. They all looked uncomfortable, unsure, waiting for her to say something. I'm sorry, Kendra said, her voice small but clear. I said you killed my dad. I blamed you. And you went back for him anyway, even after what I said. Javier knelt down so he was at her eye level. We went back because of what you said. Because you reminded us of what really mattered. Your words hurt, yeah, but they also woke us up. Made us realize we couldn't live with leaving him behind. So you don't hate me? Amy stepped forward, tears in her eyes. We could never hate you. Your dad saved our lives. Getting him back to you was the least we could do. Kendra looked at each of them, these soldiers who'd become family through the worst circumstances imaginable. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for bringing him home. They stayed for an hour, talking and laughing and remembering. The weight that had been crushing all of them for weeks finally lifted. They'd all said and done things they regretted. They'd all carried impossible guilt. But somehow they'd found their way through it together. 3 months later, Kendra stood with her mother in the front row of a military ceremony. Devin was there too, standing with his squad. They were all in uniform, though Devin still leaned on a cane and probably would for a while yet. The ceremony was complicated. The squad was receiving medals for extraordinary courage in combat. But they were also receiving official reprimands for going AWOL and conducting an unauthorized operation. The military needed to acknowledge both the heroism and the rule-breaking. Devin didn't care about any of it. He was just grateful to be standing there at all, with his daughter watching and his brothers and sisters in arms beside him. After the ceremony, the squad gathered for photos. They insisted Kendra be in them. She stood in the front wearing her father's old dog tags that he'd given her, surrounded by the people who'd proven that loyalty and love matter more than rules or regulations. That evening, back home in their own kitchen, Devin sat helping Kendra with her math homework. It was ordinary, normal, boring, and it was the most beautiful thing in the world, Dad, Kendra said, looking up from her textbook.